I just, yeah, I better do that. I better do this. 1 minute, my friends. Just go. I just forgot. What's the word for a
Vineyard.
Thank you. Yes. So somebody, you're growing your vineyard, you're caring for you. Thank you, Selma. You're growing your vineyard, and you're allowed to do all the work necessary for 6 years. You're allowed to collect. You're allowed to harvest. But the Shana Shvi'it, on the 7th year, Shabbat Shabbaton Yeh La'aretz, the land shall have a sabbatical year, Shabbat L'Hashem, and you're no longer allowed to do that. I want to read all of Psukim. It's not the halachot here that I want to focus on right now. As you know, however, this is a Shnat Shemitah. The year 572 is a Shnat Shemitah in the land of Israel. I don't think it's going to play itself out so much in Toronto unless we buy imported fruits that were grown during Shnat Shemitah. That may pose a problem. And one of the problems probably will be a little bit more acute at Sukkot time, because many of us buy etrogim that are grown in Israel. Now, if they were grown during Shnat Shemitah, that does mean that there are certain halachot as to how to dispose of produce grown during the land, during Shnat Shemitah. But that'll be something we'll talk about another time. Let's go back to this pasuk, the very beginning. By the Behar Moshe, Behar Sinai more. The Torah seems to introduce this conversation, this parsha that Moshe is obligated to teach Bnei Israel. It's introducing it to us by telling us that Hashem said this to Moshe Rabbeinu, where? Behar Sinai. So we're in Sefer Vayikra. We're almost finished Sefer Vayikra. It's Parshat Behar. One more parsha left. The story of Matan Torah happened in Sefer Shemot. It happened in Parshat Yitro. There are parts of it in Parshat Mishpatim. And yet the Torah now, toward the end of Sefer Vayikra, wants us to understand that apparently the content of the Parsha of Shemitah, which is the first part of this Parsha, was recited to Moshe, taught to Moshe while he was at Har Sinai. So let's listen to Rashi's question, which is really a famous question that the Chachamim, the Chachmei Gemara, ask. And Rashi says this, Ma inyan Shemitah etzel Har Sinai? Rashi's question, the Chachmim's question is, I don't understand. Why is the Torah specifically juxtaposing the notion of the lesson of Shemitah and Har Sinai? Why is it saying that this was taught at Har Sinai? Every mitzvah was said at Har Sinai. So all the parashot that we've learned from Sefer Shemot on, from Parshat Yitro, they're all at Har Sinai. And yet, all the other parashot do not begin with Vayedaber Hashem Moshe Behar Sinai Lemor. Doesn't begin that way. Let's continue with Rashi. Ella. So Rashi says the purpose of identifying the location is this. Ma Shemitah ne'emru klaloteha upiroteha b'diktukeh misinai. Just as all the general principles and all these specific and very detailed laws that are connected with Shnat Shemitah were taught to Moshe at Sinai. Av kulan ne'emru klalotehen v'diktuhem b'sinai. So too, all the mitzvot, every mitzvah, was taught in its generalities and in its specifications at Har Sinai. So let's stop and just think what we just heard. We heard Rashi tell us that, in fact, every mitzvah was taught at Har Sinai. In that case, we still need to ask ourselves a question. Well, if that's true, that every mitzvah was taught at Har Sinai, the general framework of the mitzvah and the specific details, then what's the question? The question is, so why is the laws of Shemitah somehow highlighted? Why did it have to be Shemitah? Why couldn't it have been Shabbos? Kibbud Av V'Ein. Something to do with the judicial system. They were all told. And yet, for a specific undisclosed reason right now, Hashem is making a connection between the laws of Shemitah and the law and the fact that this was taught at Har Sinai. So the Shemitah now, in some ways, is it a paradigm? Is it paradigmatic of other things or not? Well, why was it singled out? So I want to take a look at a couple of ideas with you from two different sources. And the first source is Rav Moshe Feinstein. Moshe Feinstein, the Sefer Tzaddik Livracha, whose name we've mentioned before here, died in the year 1986, was an extraordinarily beloved posek of enormous dimension, who served as the halachic authority for North America for years and years and years, clearly till the point that his life, his neshama went back to the Rebbeinu Shalom. Amongst the things that he was most famous for was his set of responsa. He wrote Moshe. But in addition to writing responsa, and really in some ways clarifying halakha in so many ways for Jewry throughout the world, he also did collect and write a divrei Torah on the Torah, and that's called Darash Moshe. And so in his work called Darash Moshe, Rabbi Feinstein Zatzal addresses this question: why did the Torah somehow want to highlight Shemitah more than other mitzvot that also were given at Har Sinai? And here's what he says, and with your permission, I'll read part of it, not the whole thing. It's not a very long section, but some of the language and some of the ideas, I think, are often worthwhile reading in the original, even though we're going to be doing a little bit of translating. Rabbi Feinstein maintains, "Hachiyuv l'kaimam hu dafka mitzad shenitztavinu b'Sinai al yedei Moshe Rabbeinu." He says you have to understand that the purpose of the Torah associating this mitzvah with Har Sinai is to make it very clear that the obligation, the imperative to fulfill this mitzvah is rooted in Sinai, the experience of the lawgiver giving us the law. That may seem to be obvious, but Rav Moshe wants to unpack that for us just a little bit more. The hachiluk, I'm skipping a little bit. The I'm not going to skip. I'm going to say something else. I think what he's about to say is important. But Moshe here tells us, of course, that prior to Matan Torah, were there any mitzvot in the world? Were there any mitzvot in the world? And the answer to that is, there were. As we know, there's something called Sheva Mitzvot B'nai Noach, that the sons, the population of the world, which at that point were the population that grew from Noach, they were given a series of 7 mitzvot. Those mitzvot existed prior to the experience of Matan Torah at Har Sinai. So Rav Moshe says that B'nai Noach, who had an obligation to fulfill those mitzvot, once the Torah was given, the experience and the reality of Matan Torah superseded whatever sort of obligation might have existed. Meaning, this is an important point, that Rav Moshe Feinstein says that whatever sort of reason, conceptual and moral existed prior to Matan Torah sort of dissipated. The experience of Matan Torah became that source of obligation. That was the source of obligation. That point, says Rav Moshe, is important to consider. Achiluk bin atzivui leMoshe, the distinction between the commandments given to Moshe, b'netinat Torah at the time of Har Sinai, letzivui ha'adam, the obligations given to earlier man, nir'ah, it seems to me, says Rabbi Feinstein, demitchila hayat tzivui lahasbir lekayem mitzad tam asichli. Says this is the point, that prior to Matan Torah, what was the imperative to do, quote unquote, a mitzvah? It was a man's ability to understand the value in doing the mitzvah. That there was some sort of compelling logic to do it. It made sense, whether it's moral or other. That was the reason that there was an expectation of mankind to fulfill whatever sort of religious obligation, mitzvot, existed prior to that. Not because, says Rav Moshe, God commanded it, but because the human mind conceived of it, understood it, was excited by it, agreed with it, and maybe ultimately we all said, yeah, that's a good idea. Society was built around whatever principles. Matan Torah superseded that. And so says Rav Moshe Feinstein, let's take a look at Shemitah. It might have been that there could have been an attitude that Shemitah might have been a good idea. But you know what? Excuse me. When you think about what Shemitah calls upon the Jewish farmer and Jewish society to do, does this make sense to you? Does it make sense to you to say to a nation inhabiting a land, okay, everybody who owns land, which at that time, of course, was every family was given an achuzah, was given a holding in the land of Israel. Okay, for 1 year, we're going to stop working the land. Okay, everybody okay with that? Nobody's okay with that. It makes no sense. There's nothing logically compelling. So why should we do it? There's only one reason to do it. There's only one reason to do it, and that's the reason because it was commanded by God. In other words, what Moshe is trying to say to us, I believe, is this, is that the nature of what's right or wrong, if left up to the human mind to determine, may come to conclusions which sometimes seem appropriate, but sometimes not. And the only source, Rav Moshe seems to suggest, that can be relied upon for an ultimate good is that of the divine imperative, not the innate moral sense that human beings have. You know, at the very beginning of Pirkei Avot, as probably you know, the first Mishnah begins, Moshe kibel Torah Sinai, the Masar Yoshua. Moshe received Torah at Sinai. He then transmitted it to Yeshua. Yeshua was Kenim, and beyond that. In his very first comment to the Mishnah, Rabbi Vladimir Bartanura posits, I think, what is an important principle, and I think it's very much connected to what Moshe Feinstein is saying. Of all the tractates in the Gemara, this tractate, or the set of Mishnayot called Avot, is very unique because in all other tractates of the Gemara, there are legal issues which are decided. There are debates, there are very vigorous debates, and finally there may in fact be some sort of resolution. This is the halacha, it's not the halacha, but we talk about it in halachic terms. Mutar, asur, tamei, tahor, patur, not chayav. So all of that language is pretty much missing throughout the entire 6 prakim of Masechet Avot. It is not a tractate of halacha, says Rav Ovadia Bartanura. So what's it a tractate of? And he says one word, midot. Midot, and he actually says musar. It is the notion of understanding ethical behavior and understanding the significance of moral values. That's what it's about. And then he says this. He says, but this is not the only book of moral values and ethical behavior in the world. So many nations of the world have their chachamim, their elders, their sages write the same things. So you might think there's really no preeminence over our sages writing it, then their sages writing it. So if any culture says we have our book of Proverbs, we have our book of values and ethics, Jews have their book of values and ethics. It's called Masechet Avot, Pirkei Avot. So they have theirs, we have ours, and everybody's equal, because how can you distinguish between the value of one human society's conception of values and another human society's conception of values? There's no way of judging, except, says Rabbi Vladimir Bartanura, the first phrase in Pirkei Avot is what distinguishes it. Moshe kibel Torah Sinai. Rabbi Vladimir Bartanura says that the entire collection of Masechet Avot is really, however, a compendium of ethical teachings said by the leaders of the generations who said them. But the source of those ethical teachings was not the creativity and the genius of all those rabbis. The source of those teachings was the fact that it was originated squarely at Har Sinai. It was God's Torah and the teachings that God told Moshe, who passed it on to Yeshua and the Zekimim, that become the source, not just for halachic literature, but also for moral literature, for moral understanding and comprehension. And so when we talk about the development of our understanding of ethical behavior, we squarely root it in the divine imperative. And by virtue of that, we take it out to a very large degree from the realm of human perception. It's not just an opinion. Opinions could be relative, and there's no way of judging one person's opinion to another. But Rav Moshe is telling us that's precisely the point here. Shemitah may not make any sense. There's no way to logically convince a farmer, I have a great idea for you. Don't work for a year. Okay? It doesn't even have to be a farmer. But be that as it may, if you say that, there's no compelling reason. So why do it? And there's only one reason. Hashem commanded you to. And if you trust in Hashem, and if you believe that Hashem is the source of goodness, and we believe that Hashem is looking out for our welfare and not for our harm, that Hashem is not going to deliberately put a stumbling block in front of us so we experience failure and suffering and punishment, if there's no reason for that, then we will trust in Him. And if Hashem says do it this way, it'll turn out good. It'll be good. It'll be okay. I don't know how that is because I can't see the future. So Rav Moshe tells us again that the purpose for fulfilling Shemitah is not all of the other reasons. It's simply because God commanded, and that's why it begins by saying, the version of Moshe, the Har Sinai Lemor, happened at Har Sinai, connecting that. And in some ways, Shemitah is different than all the other mitzvot because it might seem less logically compelling, but ultimately all the mitzvot are rooted in Sinai and not because of any compelling reason. I want to share with you a different explanation. And this is an author who I read a lot and I love, and his name is Rabbi Zalman Sorotskin, and his commentary on the Torah is called Uznaim Torah. Mentioned before, Rabbi Sorotskin is a more contemporary writer. He himself is a Holocaust survivor following the Holocaust. He settled in Israel. I think he died in the 1970s. And in his compendium of commentary, he has a really interesting take on this as well. Different than Rav Moshe's, but worth, I think, going through. So he says the following. When you take a look at the mitzvot in the Torah, and you begin to try to sort of understand how they are intended to affect us, the reader, the listener, he says, in some ways, that's not such a hard thing to do because we have so many different categories of mitzvot. So this is what he suggests. There are mitzvot that are given to us because they teach us things that we need to know. For example, how to deal with parents. Kibbud av v'em. It's an important social factor. In fact, one of the commentators, I think it's the Yitzchak Barbanel, suggests when it comes to understanding mitzvah of kibbud av v'em that in some ways it's a precursor. It's our training ground for becoming obedient to God. How do you learn to be obedient to God? You need to practice being obedient. Where's the best place to practice being obedient? At home with your mother and father, who are more like God figures when you're growing up than anything else. So it's a great mitzvah because in some ways it's your practice ground for growing into adulthood and being able, more or less, to find yourself in a relationship with the Ribono Shel Olam and for you to accept upon yourself that He is the master and we listen to what He says. Let's go on. But the Torah also tells us, gives us guidelines how to get along with other people, not just our parents, other people. And there's so many mitzvot, Parshat Mishpatim, how to get along, what you shouldn't do, what you should do in case you do it, what should we do? That makes perfect sense to me. In some ways, what Zalman Sorotskin is doing is what Rav Moshe suggests we shouldn't do. Rav Moshe says it's not about compelling explanations. It's about just doing that which is the root of divinely. Rabbi Sorotskin starts from a sort of different place, and he says, but when you think about the mitzvot in the Torah, human mind does search out ways of understanding things, putting it in the finite framework with which we have. So put in the finite framework of our minds, many of the mitzvot, once categorized, you can see, well, somehow they become so much more compelling. He says, we're going to continue. There are mitzvot which tell us how we should treat and respect our teachers. Okay, that also makes sense. The people who have been given the task of educating a new generation, he says, well, that makes sense that they should occupy a place in society that needs to somehow be safeguarded, because if they are the mechanism, the tool by which the laws and the ideas somehow get transmitted, hopefully effectively, then they have to be given the Hadarta Pnei Zaken. You have to respect them because they play an important role. What about a king? The political leaders, the Hanasi Ba'amcha Lo Ta'or. You're not allowed to curse and to bring harm to the leaders of your community. Also, I think it makes sense, although the the more we live in the modern world, I think we see that there may be a lot of people, large segments of our society, which struggle with how to sort of understand that. But in a conceptual framework, the idea that society needs leaders, and those leaders, once they are given their responsibilities, are expected to carry them out, we have an obligation to make sure they carry them out well. I have obligations towards my children, my descendants. So the Torah tells me, I can't simply ignore my children. I have to give them the tools that they're going to require to lead a contributing life. There's Mishnah and Masechet Kiddushin. Even the Mishnah says the mitzvot ala abein ala av, av ala abein. There's certain mitzvot that a parent is obligated to do to raise their child. One of them is Yeshomrim. You have to teach your kid lischot. You have to teach your kid to swim. Just keep in mind, in the context of that Mishnah that was said in Eretz Yisrael, which had a lot of streams, a lot of wadis, a lot of bodies of water that people likely had to traverse in order to get to point A and point B. So this was a skill that was necessary in simple survival. So parents, yes, there are mitzvot in the Torah which teach us about that. There are laws in the Torah which teach us about ourselves. El atzmo. We are prohibited from doing anything that would inappropriately bring harm or disproportionately bring harm to ourselves. And yes, there's a certain level of harm or risk, I'm going to say, that we have to undertake to lead our lives. We can't live in a complete shelter, otherwise we're not going to be able to do much. But there are things which are within the acceptable realm of risk, and there are things which are beyond the acceptable realm of risk. And there are halachic parameters for that. So the Torah teaches us so much about how to protect ourselves. Torah tells us also how to relate to Avdo, our servants. And again, the word Eved in Hebrew, we're going to talk a little bit more about that in Yirtzeh Hashem tonight, is not evocative of the slave picture that you have from Yetziat Mitzrayim, and God forbid whether it exists in other countries of the world, the bent over and being beaten. That is one connotation of slave, but when the Torah talks about the word Eved, it's not talking about that slave, it's actually talking about the indentured servant. This is a person who enters into a legal arrangement, and that his services, her services, are owned by the master. That's an indentured servant. So the Torah tells us, okay, that's an institution of dut that is acceptable. But you, as the master, the person who owns that contract of the indentured servant, you have to know how to treat this person. Sheish shanim yavod. He's allowed to work for you for 6 years, but that's it. After that, he's supposed to go free. It's crazy. Like, why? If I bought the contract, shouldn't there be no limit to it? No, there is a limit. But it even goes further than that. The Oznaim LaTorah, Rav Sorotskin says, we're also taught about how we should have respect for gerim, strangers, whether they be strangers who are not Jewish or newcomers to the community who have converted to Judaism. And there may be a natural tendency amongst us to somehow not embrace them the way they should be embraced. So Torah gives us a host of mitzvot, v'ahavta ger. We have an obligation to love the stranger, especially the stranger who in fact has become one of our tribe who's converted to Judaism. But I even have a whole host of halachot, how to treat ba'alei chayim, animals. You would think, okay, animals, okay, that I can do whatever I want with, right? I can't do anything to people, the slaves, the servants, the parent. Okay, but animals, no. Versus, you're not allowed to bring undue suffering to an animal. You're not allowed to. If you happen to be walking on the road and your enemy's donkey has collapsed beneath the weight of the pack that was put on him, you're obligated to stop. My enemy, the person I hate, we don't get along. We hate each other. I'm not going to help him. No, you're not helping him. You're helping the animal. My concern for the animal outweighs whatever personal animosity I may feel about the owner of the animal. So look at this. The Torah is telling me just about every relationship that I could possibly engage in is somehow directed by Torah thought. That's it, right? That takes care of everything. Then comes Rabbi Sorotsky and says, well, that's not 100% true. You might find this hard to believe. Well, it might be hard to believe that our holy Torah commanded us to relate with dignity, with honor, El Ha'adamah, to the land. But the land is totally inanimate. Asher anu yoshvim oleh. We're living on it, but the land, rocks and sand and stone and like, it's nothing. There's nothing. What am I? I'm not hurting anybody's feelings. Yachas miyuchad el domain, says Rabbi Siratsky. The Torah seems to ask us to include a special understanding of the relationship that exists with the inanimate world around us. She'eino margish, which has no feelings. Lefi kotzer havana shelanu, even if we just don't get it. She'eino margish. Oh, lefi kotzer havana shelanu. We don't get it at all. We can't understand. You want to tell me about parents and slaves and servants and converts, and I totally understand that. Animal, I even understand the animals, but the land. So Rabbi Siratsky maybe was not yet aware of the environmental movement that was going to overwhelm the world, but at the time that he wrote this, that didn't seem to be the perception. But he's also wondering within, of course, the ancient world, was that the perception? How is it possible that we're going to invoke the ideas of holiness, of kedusha, when it comes to something which is so bereft of the abilities to understand and appreciate and value the notion of kedusha? But the Torah says, "V'shavta haaretz Shabbat l'Hashem." Yes, the land will experience a Shabbat. So, therefore, says the Rabbi Siratsky, the Oznaim LaTorah, in some ways, this represents a whole revolutionary way of looking at the world, maybe suggesting that the Torah is here, in fact, for the first time ever, injecting into the human experience the notion of some environmental awareness that needs to guide the way we behave. And he said, because once the first says, what if he came up with a great idea? It's a great idea. This is like a chap. You can just see some yeshiva guy thinking this through. How about if we put part of the land for Shabbos, like nothing, and the other part we work? We're going to rotate it. Oh, perfect. Some is going to rest, some is going to work. As a machaya, I may not be working all the land, but I'm still having part of the land. I'm still growing things. I don't have to worry so much. So therefore, you might have thought that could be a solution. But of course, that's not what the Torah says. The Torah says, no, it's got to be the entire land. Everything. Everything. Hukahi me'et borei olam ve'enata. And you, the individual human, ben adam, the lowly human being, rashai leharher achalecha. You cannot use what you think is your ingenuity, your cleverness, your science, your knowledge, and sort of uproot the divine command. So according to Rabbi Oznaim LaTorah, Rabbi Siratsky, this mitzvah was specifically chosen to be said at Har Sinai. They all were. This was the mitzvah that Hashem wanted to outline, not because this was said and all the others weren't. This was said, but it is so different than all the others. All the others might, in fact, have some sort of compelling reason that we would say, I get it. This seems to be so different because it's inanimate and for which we seemingly have very little relationship. Now, again, for those of us, well, I'll speak for myself. Of course, I live here in Toronto. I'm an urbanite. I live in a big city. So the idea that somehow the big city person isn't connected to Shemitah. And the truth of the matter is, it's probably something that most of us don't think of as this is an amazing mitzvah. I'm not a farmer. And maybe we're missing that part of our understanding of the universe. Maybe. When you daven Sugei de Zimra a little bit more carefully, and you get to one of the two Mizmorim that the Gemara tells us, Rabbi Yossi tells us in Masechet Shabbos, is one of the two Mizmorim that really have to be highlighted. Rashi says it's Perek Kuf Mem Chet, and if you go through Perek Kuf Mem Chet 148 in Tehillim, which is one of the two key Mizmorim, you don't have time you're going to want to say this one. You'll see that you're talking about noticing the natural world around you. Shelek, Kitor, Ruach, Sarah, Harim, Va'ot, just noticing it all. Because sometimes we don't pay attention. Those of us living, we just don't pay attention to the natural world. Maybe that's what Shemitah, in a small part, is intended to do. And its message to urban dwellers like us, who are really not connected to growing things. And besides that, we live in Canada, so we're not even having the mitzvah of Shemitah affecting what we do here. But maybe its other message is the message of pay attention to the natural world. Okay, so I want to move ahead a little bit in Perek Kaf Hey. We're just talking about the first pasuk of Shemitah. I want to jump to pasuk Yud. So pasuk Yud is telling us about another sort of holy institution in time, not Shemitah. Shemitah is the 7th year of the 7-year cycle. But 7 cycles of 7 years brings you to what's called the 50th year. And in Hebrew, that's Yovel. And in English, that would be the Jubilee Year. Yovel is the 50th year. So the 49th year would be a Shnat Shemitah. And in fact, the 50th year has many of the same restrictions on growing as the 49th year. So once every 50 years, you would find the Jewish community in Israel trying to manage keeping everybody alive and everybody thriving with not being able to work the land in the 49th and not being able to work the land in the 50th, which means obviously that relies on God's blessings, bracha. Every Shemitah cycle relied on Hashem's bracha, that the 6th year would be a stupendous year of overgrowth, but even more so would have to be for the Yovel, which follows immediately after Shemitah. Right. But let's take a look, if you will, with me at pasuk Yud. And here's what it says: V'kidashtem et shnat ha'chamishim shana ukratem dror ba'aretz l'chol yoshveha yovel hi tihiyeh lachem v'shavtem ish el achuzato v'ish el mishpachto tashuvu. English: you shall sanctify the 50th year and proclaim freedom throughout the land for all its inhabitants. It shall be the Yovel, Jubilee year for you. You shall return each man to his ancestral heritage, and you shall return each man to his family. Okay, so a few points here. Number one, Americans here, or those who love Philadelphia, probably heard that. You heard the English, I'm sure, and you shall proclaim freedom throughout the land. Where would you find that? You would find that on the Liberty Bell in Philadelphia. This is where it comes from. Ukratem dror ba'aretz, and you shall proclaim liberty. So what sort of liberty? What happens in Israel in the 50th year? 2 main things happen. One is the indentured servant, the person who was sold into servitude, either by the Beit Din, because he was found guilty of a crime and was unable to pay the victim of the crime the financial penalty that was due him. He had no resources to do that. Then the Beit Din would sell him, and the proceeds of the sale would go to offset the fine that was to be paid to the victim. That's case number one. Case number two is a person himself didn't do a crime, but finds himself in such dire straits, he's unable to provide for himself, he's unable to provide for his family, he has no means by which to earn a living, and realizes that the only thing he can do, the only asset that he has is him, his body. So he would sell himself. He would enter into an agreement with the master. He would sell his services to the master for 6 years, and then the 7th year he would go free. But the Torah tells us about the following possibility. It's after the 6th year, so the 7th year the man should go free, and he chooses not to go free. He likes being a servant more than he wants the freedom of personal choices. Maybe he's too scared of that. So the Torah, as you probably remember, dictates the ceremony. They got to go to the Beit Din, the mezuzah. They put a hole in his. They puncture his ear, and he stays then as a permanent slave, but not really totally permanent. He then remains with the owner until the Jubilee Year, which is the 50th year. So I don't know where in that cycle of 50 years the guy decided that he wanted to remain as a servant. It could be just a few years to the Jubilee Year, or it could be decades to the Jubilee Year. Either way, once the Yovel comes, that man goes free. That's it, game over. Nothing doing, he's pushed out the door. He cannot stay with the owner anymore. The other thing that happens, just briefly, is that when Bnei Israel crossed the Yarden after they left Egypt, they encountered the 7 nations. They engaged in 7 years of fighting to conquer the land of Israel. Then they engaged in 7 years of hitnachalut, of occupying the land. And that part, that hitnachalut, every shevet, every family of every shevet was given a part of the land as their family's forever inheritance. So it happened that there may be some people for whom also they were no longer able to sustain themselves, and their only asset was the land in which they were working. And in order to sustain themselves, they would sell their land, sad as it may be. Torah tells us, as sad as it may be, there was a moment of redemption. The 50th year, the Jubilee year, was the year that the land would then revert back to the family of the original owner. There's a lot of Torah on that, which we're not going to go into. But here's the thing that I want to go back and make sure that you heard carefully. So when the Torah talks about this year, the Jubilee year, this is what it says. Ukratim dror ba'aretz, and you shall declare freedom in the land. Okay. L'chol yoshveha. What does that mean? To all its inhabitants. Okay, 1 second. In all its inhabitants. Let's take a look at the Sforno for 1 minute. Sforno, Rabbi Sforno, the great Italian commentary, who's part of the Mikroot Gedolot. So he has an interesting explanation here that I think it's worth just considering, and then I want to just unpack it a little bit more. I'm going to read it with you. Sforno, 25:10. Second. Here it is. Yovel hi tihiyeh lachem. This is a Jubilee year for you. For whom? So you're likely to think, well, given the 2 scenarios that I described, maybe it's a Jubilee year for the people who are called indentured slaves, and maybe it's a Jubilee year for the people who have to sell their ancestral home. They're the ones who likely are the ones benefiting the most. It's a Jubilee year. They're the ones. I mean, I don't know whether Jubilee in English is coming from the word jubilation. Never thought about it, but likely they're the ones who are going to feel most liberated, right? They're like the indentured slave, liberated. The person who lost their ancestral home is somehow going to feel that he's back together with the land that should be his or hers. Yovel hi tihiyeh lachem. Shetihiyu gam atem b'nei chorim mishibud ha'umot. That all of you, not just the slaves and not just the person who sold his ancestral home, every one of you should be considered in some ways liberated. So according to Sforno, lachem suggests that in some ways it's an assurance rather than a command. So when you first think about it, so no, you got to do something in order to accomplish this goal. But Sforno, I think, with a little nuance, maybe looking at it slightly differently. I'm not sure that he sees it so much as a command, as somehow a description of a future that's a little bit different. You too, just again, you too shall be free from the subjugation of other nations. So according to Sforno, when the Yovel, the Jubilee year comes, it brings freedom. That's true, but not just to the servants. According to Sforno, also to the masters, because they avoid the consequence of having to worry about the Yovel laws. So when you read, for example, if you take a look at Sefer Yirmiyahu, you take a look at Perek Lamed 34, one of the reasons of the Babylonian conquest of Eretz Yisrael, as Yirmiyahu Navi describes it, was the people's neglect of the requirement to free their slaves and their refusal to release the Avadim in the Jubilee year. So Yirmiyahu says that was considered to be a serious, serious deficiency for which Hashem said the only proper consequence was the invasion of the Babylonians. Babylonians? Whoa. So based on this, Sforno says, by observing the command of Yovel, all of the Jewish people, including the masters, are somehow assured their freedom, and they don't have to worry, as it were, about the onset of an enemy coming to bring them harm. So Rabbi Yehuda Leib Ginsburg, the author of Yalkut Yehuda, and I quote him a lot because I think he has, I really like him. I think he has interesting things to say. He adds an interesting point to this, and he says this, that the laws of Yovel ensure our freedom in a slightly different sense. The limits that the Torah puts on permissible servitude help us prevent the growth and the emergence of a hopeless servant class that harbors a sort of deep-seated resentment toward the establishment. It's an interesting idea. But according to Rabbi Ginsburg, when the Torah says you shall be redeemed and freed, it's not just talking about the servants, and he's not just talking about the ancestral home, he's talking about the entire country. When we as a country enact and embrace the notion of returning of the slaves, what we're doing, in fact, is not just helping that individual family. We are helping the societal attitudes that get promoted by the societal institutions that we create, promote, and feed. And if you have a class of people who forever remain subjugated and indentured servants, it's very likely what you're also doing is maintaining a group of people, a subgroup that continues to build up resentment of what they don't have, and look at the haves and the have-nots and begin to think and dream about grabbing that freedom back for themselves. The Torah's Yovel system, says Rabbi Ginsburg, ensures that the servant status will never last beyond a generation or two, because every servant is freed on Yovel, whereupon all people are once again on equal socioeconomic footing. So 50 years. So if you became an indentured servant for the first year of 50, so 50 years is like a generation. But every time we have a Yovel, it's almost like a reset button for society. And Rabbi Ginsburg suggests, I don't know whether any social research has been done on this to prove that his theory is correct, but he suggests that this sort of almost eliminates the chance of what he calls like class warfare and violent uprisings by angry, vengeful lower class. The institution of permanent servitude sows the seeds of desperation and hostility, which almost always guarantees occasional outbreak of unrest and insurrection. The modern political landscape, probably more clearly perceived in the United States, I think may in fact be a reflection of this idea of the inability that we seem to have. And I don't want to get into a debate, but there's definitely seems to be a distinction of social classes in some modern societies, North American, Western civilizations. And we can see so clearly the hatred. And if anything, the events over the last couple of summers have shown us that it's just simmering under the surface. And we can see that maybe Rabbi Ginsburg put his finger on something clever and said, yes, the Torah was aware that this could happen, that the continuously disadvantaged members of our society are not going to take it forever and ever. There's an interesting parish that I saw, and I honestly cannot recall who said this, but it's a fascinating insight. When you think about the history of the Jewish people, of course, one of the transformational moments in our time, or periods in our time, was Mitzrayim. And that I spoke about this on my Shabbos Agorot Russia, that it was understood, even Moshe Rabbeinu called that period of time as Kur HaBarzel, the iron furnace, that somehow that experience forged us into a greater nation than we otherwise would have been, with abilities and maybe responsibilities that we otherwise would not have had. But how did we get there? How did we get there? So one part of the story is clear. We were in Egypt because there was a famine, and we came down to Egypt. And Paro, the evil, evil Paro, came up with a clever plot to enslave the Jewish people. And we seemed to be victims. We were victimized. And I don't think that's not the story. It is the story. We were victimized. But one of the commentaries I said is, well, that victimization, while it's true we were victimized by the Egyptians, might have been actually midah keneged midah, measure for measure. What does that mean? So think back to what you remember from the end of Sefer Breshit. So Yosef, of course, was selected and chosen by Paro to be in charge of the country. And knowing that there were going to be 7 years of famine, and seeing that Yosef seemed to have some sort of strategy and plot that made a lot of sense economically and socially, Paro put him in charge. So when things got really, really bad in Egypt, so people started coming and asking for food. And Yosef said, okay, then buy it. He didn't just hand it out. He asked them to buy it. So do you remember what happened when they ran out of food? And they're not ran out of food, when they ran out of money. So the period of famine went on for 7 years. So the Torah tells us at one point, Yosef has this idea of how he's going to sell the food. Do you remember what it was? He asked the population to sell themselves into slavery, to become slaves to Paro, servants to Paro. Now you wonder, this paper says, you have to wonder, what was the attitude of the Egyptian population to this idea that Yosef had? How did they take to it? Were they grateful? Oh, thank you for giving us food. It was wonderful. Did they see him as a benevolent ruler? Or was the fact that he created a scenario by which they could get food, but in order to get the food, they had to themselves become servants? What did that do? So this particular paper suggested that may have been what sowed the seeds for Egyptians being so willing to enslave the Jewish people, because they thought, you know what, one of theirs did this to us, so we think that it's not such a bad idea for us to do that to them. Paro asked us to do that. They somehow found some sort of moral justification because of what Yosef had done. So what I'm trying to suggest, I don't know if it's a strong suggestion, is could it be that what happened to us was a result of that sort of built up fury and anger and disappointment that the Egyptian society had towards themselves being enslaved? And so sometimes that anger and that upset gets channeled and gets expressed in ways which are more violent or less violent, more socially acceptable, less socially acceptable, or more discriminatory against a certain segment of the society. And maybe, I'm suggesting that it could be one of the reasons that this full slavery ended up developing the way it was, because the seeds were sown by Yosef HaTzadik, who thought that he might have found a great solution to a problem. And I thought that was a fascinating interpretation. And when we have a chance to talk in a few minutes, I'd love to hear what your thoughts are about that. I'll go a little bit further in Parshat. You know what? Before we go a little bit further, I just want to share one other idea. This is by Rabbi Siratskin as well, who also wanted to share an idea as to what is intended by the Torah's description that the Yovel should be seen as an opportunity for you. The Torah describes this liberation as lachem. So Siratskin says that the freedom is the freedom that you have of not having to own a slave or a servant. And as the Gemara tells us in a couple of places, for the Jewish owner of a servant, you haven't really bought yourself a lot. It's not as though you're now, yes, I have an amazing servant that's going to serve me. In some ways, the obligations that the halakha places upon the master are so onerous that it's as though the master takes upon himself the servitude. Yes, he has to. He has a servant who is obligated to follow instructions and do certain work. He can't do all work. There's certain work that, according to halakha, the master cannot ask the servant to do. But all of these limitations, all these obligations, all of these mindfulness expectations create a sense of psychological servitude, not for the servant, but actually for the master. So Rabbi Sorotskin wonders whether, in some ways, and he's a little lighthearted about this, he suggests we lose a degree of our independence when we become very reliant on the assistance and services of other people. I don't do things for myself. I can't do it myself. I have my people. I have my guy. I have my this. I have my that. And so each one of the people that we have to do this, to do that for us, in some ways, are they helping us? Are they enabling us? Or are they disabling us? Are they creating within us a sense of limitation? So if servitude you would think of as that state of being where so many of your abilities are restricted because of these limitations, Rabbi Sorotskin wonders whether the institution of servitude is an enabler or a disabler, not for the servant, but for the master. Because at the end of the day, we may become so dependent on other people that maybe we need to see that state of dependency itself as a limitation to our freedom. And also, of course, it also is another expression when we have that level of servitude in our lives. It also is a way of our exerting control over other people. And maybe the mitzvah of shichur, of adim, of letting go and liberating the slaves, reminds us of our limitation and our capacity to control others. As a parent, and as a teacher, every day, sometimes you realize just how little control you have. Like if you're going to try and get involved in an argument with even a 5-year-old kid, guaranteed you're losing. You're losing. And if you think, I'm a teacher, I'm going to show them, any good Rebbe in my mind knows that if you want to get into a power struggle, 99% of the time, the adult loses. Maybe not immediately, but in the long run. There's just so little absolute control that we have that maybe this whole notion is to remind us of just who do you think you're fooling? How much control do you think you actually have over other people? Still in Perek Chafei, I'm jumping to Perek Chafei, Pasuk Lamed Hey. Pasuk Lamed Hey. Torah tells us this. V'chi amuch achicha u'matay yado imach v'hechezakta bo ger v'toshav v'chai imach. 25:35. Translation, I'm using the Stone Chumash again. If your brother becomes impoverished and his means falter in your proximity, you shall strengthen him, whether it's a proselyte or a resident, so that he can live with you. Okay, this is one of several instances in the Torah where we are commanded to assist needy people. Yeah, it's a mitzvah. In Sefer Shmot, the Torah presents the mitzvah to offer interest-free loans to those people who are in need. In Sefer Dvarim, a little later on, we find the obligation of tzedakah, of giving charity. Here in Parshat Behar, the Torah refers to a special aspect of tzedakah. And because it's special, it may account for its unusual phraseology in the pasuk. So rather than using the familiar term, of a poor person, which is often ani, or another common term is evyon, ani, evyon, the Torah speaks of a person who's fallen on hard times. Ki amuch u'matay yado. He's fallen. He became low. That's what Yamuch comes. He became low. Doesn't say he's poor. Doesn't say he's an evyon. Just he's fallen, and his hand can no longer reach for what it used to reach and grab onto. More than that, the Torah tells us that we need to give to individual who's needy a loan or a charitable charitable donation. The Torah says, "Vehechezakta bo," you shall support him. So what is the Torah asking us here? So Rashi, based on the Midrash Halacha called Torat Kohanim, what does Rashi say? Rashi says that you can't allow this person to decline and fall so that it's going to be hard for him to lift up. It's going to be hard for us to lift him up. But rather, what should we do? We have to strengthen him from the time he falls into difficult straits. So don't let him get so low that it's going to be harder to pick him up. So when the time this hard trouble and this troubling time falls upon him, that's when you step in. That's when you step in. Not when oh my God, he's now really so much in debt. Before he was only owing $5,000. Now he's owing $50,000. Now I'm stepping in. Well, maybe you should be stepping in when he's now beginning to decline, not when it's intensifying. And so Rashi says, quoting the Torah Kohanim, so what's this like? What can this be compared to? It can be compared to a load on a donkey. As long as it's on the donkey, one person can take hold of it and lift it up. You know, it's on the donkey. I can move it like this. I can move it like that. But once the load falls from the donkey's back onto the ground, sometimes 5 people cannot pick it up. So it's an image, and it's an image that probably would have made sense to a society using donkeys. But it's the same thing if you have a pickup truck, you have your trunk, you can redistribute the bags in your trunk so you can close the trunk. But if you don't close the trunk properly because there's too much and it all comes out, you can't pick up all the bags yourself. You might need help. So at what point should you step in? So according to Rashi, the Torah is not referring to a per person. The Torah is not referring to a per person. What's the Torah referring to? It's speaking about a person who has come onto hard times, who is experiencing some sort of financial strain. But he's not yet poor. He's not impoverished. And the Torah's point here in this pursuit is precisely that his friends, his relatives, his community should not wait till he reaches the point of desperation before offering help. So as soon as a person begins a downward slide, the people around him must come to his side and help pick him up. Now, you may be thinking, yeah, but not everybody wants that help. Okay, that's true. I get that. But that's not for you to decide. That's for him or her to decide. Your job, our job, is to go and say, listen, I see you're having a hard time. I'm happy to help. What can I do to make it easier for you? And it doesn't always have to be seen as tzedakah because you're poor and impoverished, but maybe I can help you. Maybe I can sit down and mentor you in your business. You know what? I might have an idea. I was reading this book. There's a great chapter. There's a lot of things you can do to show a person that he's not suffering by themselves, that sometimes it will require resources. It's true, but not every time. And this may be why the Torah issues the command with this sort of general phrase, vehechezakta bo. It doesn't say mammon, it doesn't talk about money. So on the level of the pshat, the Torah here doesn't issue a mitzvah to offer a loan, but it does command us to give generally some sort of level of support to keep this guy or to keep this woman afloat so they don't go downward. Now, this might mean, as I said, extending some sort of financial loan, but not always. So the message, I think, and we're going to end with this, the message conveyed by this verse applies beyond the context of financial hardship. And Torah teaches us, we have to be sensitive. We have to be watching. We have to be listening. We have to be open to seeing what's going around in our community. The people around us, how do they look? Do they look distracted? They look preoccupied? And if the answer to that is yes, then somebody should go over and say, listen, is there something I can do? Small problems sometimes, maybe not even sometimes, most of the time snowball into something huge. And we are therefore told, lift these people up before they collapse. And I think that's part of what it means to be part of a community. It's not just who can write the check. It's about, I think, who knows the nefesh ha'adam, who's sensitive, who's listening. And when a person comes to shul, let's out a krechs, and you haven't heard that krechs, you know there's something there. Hey, can I take you out for a cup of coffee? I'm a good listener. Why don't you share something with me? And from that conversation, things develop. That's what community is. That's what Behar means. And maybe that's also the term of chazak, strength. Strength doesn't mean you can withstand everything. Strength sometimes means you have the wherewithal either to ask for help, or you have the wherewithal to know you might be the person who can be the help. So that can also take a certain type of strength. My friends, thank you so much for joining us. Hopefully, I'm mute for a minute, but don't be angry. You know the time is 8:03, which means I have to rush to shul for Mincha Mari in a couple of minutes. But I'd be interested to hear some initial reactions to some of the things we had a chance to share, especially the thing about Yosef and Midah Keneged Midah. I don't know if anybody has any thoughts about that, but not just about that. Anybody? Okay, that's good too. I'm going to wish each and every one of you be well. Lag BaOmer is Wednesday night, as you know, and Thursday. So according to the Chachamim, the plague that took the lives of 24,000 students of Rabbi Akiva ended in Lag BaOmer. According to some, Lag BaOmer is also the day of the Yurtzeit of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. And according to others, it's the day that Rabbi Akiva gave smicha to his 5 students. So all in all, there are 3 reasons to say this day has the spiritual power that might uplift all of us. And can you hear us? So may it be so. I look forward to seeing you all next week, maybe even before that. Hopefully you'll have a chance to see you on Shabbos. I want to wish everybody a bracha of health, and may you be matzliach. Stay safe, everybody. Thank you so much for being here tonight.
Thank you.
Abby, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Rabbi.
Bye, everybody.